Welcome back to Library of Fear, where we explore history's darkest secrets and the crimes polite society tried to bury. Tonight we begin a tale of twisted love, betrayal, and murder within one of Newport's most respected families. This is not just a story of poison and death, it is the story of a mother who stole her own daughter's fiancé, and of how Ravenscroft Manor became a house of lies. Ravenscroft Manor and the Aldridge family. In the spring of 1858, Ravenscroft Manor was the pride of Newport, Rhode Island. The estate was a sprawling Gothic mansion of tall windows, ivy-covered walls, and echoing halls that smelled faintly of beeswax and coal smoke. It was the home of the Aldridge family, one of the most respected households in the city. Outsiders saw wealth, tradition, and refinement, but within those walls something poisonous was already spreading. Margaret Aldridge, the widowed matriarch, ruled the household with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. She was 42, strikingly beautiful for her age, with pale skin, sharp eyes, and a composure that commanded attention. Society admired her poise. They called her elegant, dignified, and loyal to her late husband's memory. But Margaret was far more than a grieving widow. Beneath her polished exterior, she was a woman obsessed with power, status, and control. She had two daughters. Eleanor, the elder, was gentle and intelligent, her father's favorite while he lived. She was 21, thoughtful, and graceful in manner. Catherine, just a year younger, was spirited and outspoken, known in Newport's small circles for her wit and curiosity. Both girls adored each other, sharing secrets late into the night, unaware that their greatest danger came not from strangers, but from their own mother. The death of Edmund Aldridge. Margaret's husband, Edmund Aldridge, had died suddenly in 1857, just 1 year before our story begins. His decline was swift. He went from hearty and strong to weak and feverish within weeks, and the doctors of Newport attributed it to a stomach complaint, a vague diagnosis common in the era. His death was mourned but not questioned. After all, respectable widows were not suspected of foul play, least of all Margaret, whose composure at the funeral was praised as dignified grief. What no one realized then was that Edmund's death marked only the beginning, for Margaret had discovered a weapon more subtle than any pistol or blade: arsenic, easily purchased as rat poison. Its effects were slow, agonizing, and easy to dismiss as natural illness. Margaret, clever and patient, used it to shape her future, one cup of tea at a time. A new suitor appears. In the months after Edmund's death, Eleanor found comfort in a man named Thomas Richardson. He was the son of a local judge, respectable, well-educated, and earnest. Their courtship blossomed quickly, and soon their engagement was announced. Society smiled upon the match. Eleanor, the sweet Aldridge daughter, betrothed to one of Newport's most promising young men, but Margaret's eyes lingered too long on Thomas. At first, Eleanor thought it was only her imagination, that her mother was merely pleased by the engagement. But Margaret's compliments became sharper, her gaze more lingering. She began to insert herself into conversations, drawing Thomas into discussions about literature, politics, and philosophy. He was flattered by her attention. After all, Margaret was beautiful, confident, and worldly, qualities that Eleanor, still young and shy, had not yet developed fully. Jealousy and control. Margaret's obsession grew quietly at first. She would interrupt Eleanor and Thomas's walks in the garden, insisting she needed Thomas's help with estate matters. She praised him endlessly, often at Eleanor's expense. Catherine noticed these things, whispering warnings to her sister late at night, but Eleanor, trusting and kind, refused to believe that her mother would betray her. Still, unease lingered. When Thomas visited, Eleanor often felt like a guest in her own home, watching as Margaret charmed him with her wit and confidence. Behind closed doors, Margaret began to criticize Eleanor's immaturity and weak constitution, planting seeds of doubt in Thomas's mind. At the same time, Eleanor's health began to falter. She suffered from frequent nausea, dizziness, and sudden weakness. Doctors suggested nervous exhaustion, recommending rest and tonics, but no matter what she tried, her condition worsened. Unbeknownst to her, Margaret had already begun slipping arsenic into her tea, whispers of death. It was not only Eleanor who suffered strange ailments. Guests of Ravenscroft Manor occasionally fell ill after dining there. A maid collapsed suddenly one evening after tasting soup meant for Eleanor. Though she survived, the incident was dismissed as bad luck, a spoiled ingredient, nothing more. But whispers began in Newport. Was Ravenscroft cursed? Dr. Hensley, a local physician, quietly began to suspect that Edmund Aldridge's death had not been natural. He noted the similarity in symptoms between Edmund and Eleanor's mysterious illness. Yet in a world where women were considered incapable of cold-blooded crime, his suspicions went unvoiced, at least for the moment. The fiancé's temptation. Meanwhile, Margaret tightened her hold on Thomas Richardson. She invited him to the manor even when Eleanor was too sick to leave her bed. She confided in him, claiming loneliness and fear of scandal. She hinted that Eleanor was too fragile, too delicate, to manage a household or a husband. Slowly, insidiously, she drew Thomas into her orbit, until he found himself torn between duty to Eleanor and desire for Margaret. Catherine, ever sharper than her sister, saw the danger clearly. She confronted Thomas, warning him that Margaret's attentions were unnatural, dangerous even. But Thomas, already compromised by Margaret's charm, brushed off Catherine's concerns. Margaret's plan was working. Piece by piece, she dismantled her daughter's future, stealing her health, her fiancé, and her peace of mind. The breaking point. By 1860, Eleanor was near death. She had lost weight, her hair had grown brittle, and her once bright eyes were dulled by constant suffering. Yet even in her weakness, she began to suspect the truth. Too often, her illness followed meals or tea prepared by her mother. Too often, Margaret seemed composed, almost satisfied, as Eleanor writhed in bed. One night, Catherine found Eleanor clutching her stomach, pale and trembling. Through tears, Eleanor whispered the unthinkable, "I believe Mother is trying to kill me." It was a revelation that Catherine had dreaded but could no longer deny. The sisters realized they were trapped inside Ravenscroft Manor with a woman who wore the mask of a grieving widow but hid the heart of a predator. The walls of Ravenscroft seemed to close in. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the corridors, her presence growing more oppressive with each passing day. Thomas, confused and compromised, drifted further under her spell. Eleanor's strength waned, but her determination grew. She and Catherine began to plot escape, gathering what little evidence they could of Margaret's schemes. They knew they had to act quickly before Eleanor's next cup of tea became her last. And so the stage was set for betrayal, pursuit, and one of the most shocking trials in Rhode Island's history. But that, my friends, is a story for part 2. What would you have done, trapped in a house where your own mother might be your killer? Was Margaret Aldridge a desperate woman clinging to security, or a cold-blooded predator hiding behind society's expectations? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this tale as disturbing as we did, subscribe to Library of Fear and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter. In part 2, we'll follow Eleanor and Catherine's desperate flight from Ravenscroft Manor, the shocking evidence they uncovered, and the trial that exposed a mother's darkest secrets. The flight from Ravenscroft. It was the night of May 15, 1861, when Eleanor and Catherine finally acted. Eleanor, weak and pale, could barely stand without her sister's support, yet her eyes were bright with determination. Catherine had gathered what she could: a satchel of clothing, a small amount of money hidden away from the household accounts, and most importantly, Thomas Richardson's portfolio of notes and medical observations. Thomas, though compromised, had begun his own investigation months earlier, quietly recording the strange symptoms in Edmund Aldridge's final illness and Eleanor's slow decline. These notes, filled with observations about stomach cramping, hair loss and faintness, all signs of arsenic poisoning, were the sisters' only hope of convincing the outside world. Shortly after midnight, they crept from their rooms, moving silently through the darkened halls. The gas lamps had been turned low, the great house asleep. Catherine carried the portfolio pressed tightly to her chest, while Eleanor leaned heavily on her arm. At the stables they saddled 2 horses with shaking hands and mounted in silence. Then came the first sound that shattered their fragile hope: the creak of a door, the unmistakable tread of Margaret's footsteps echoing across the flagstones. Margaret's fury. The sisters turned and saw her silhouette framed by the open front door. Moonlight illuminated her pale face streaked with blood. Margaret had struck her head in her haste, but she stood tall and furious, her white nightgown glowing like a ghost against the dark. "Going somewhere, my dears?" she called out, her voice calm but edged with venom. Without answering, Catherine spurred her horse forward, dragging Eleanor with her. They galloped down the long drive, gravel flying beneath their hooves. Behind them came shouts, the clang of harness buckles, and the thundering preparation of more horses. Margaret was raising pursuit, and the sisters had only a slim head start. The ride to Newport. The night countryside blurred past, the cold air burning Eleanor's lungs as she clung to the reins. Catherine shouted over the roar of hoofbeats, "If something happens to me, take the portfolio to the authorities. It's proof of everything: Father's murder, Thomas's investigation, all of it." Eleanor, though half-conscious with exhaustion, nodded grimly. "Nothing will happen. We'll survive this, and Mother will hang for what she's done." But even as the words left her mouth, Catherine glanced behind and saw riders closing the distance. Their pursuers had fresher horses and the advantage of strength. Margaret herself, mounted and furious, led the charge, her hair whipping in the wind, her face set in a mask of rage. The 20-minute gallop to Newport felt like an eternity. The sisters' horses stumbled, foam flecking their mouths, but the glow of the town lights drew closer. Salvation was near, the town square. At last the sisters burst into Newport's town square, their cries shattering the stillness. "Help! Help us!" they screamed, rousing half the town from sleep. Windows flew open, lanterns flared, and townspeople poured into the streets in bewilderment. The night constable, lantern in hand, rushed forward, demanding explanation. At first their story sounded absurd. 2 young women claiming their mother had murdered their father, poisoned her own daughter, and stolen her fiancé. In another circumstance, they might have been dismissed as hysterical, their accusations chalked up to grief or madness. But then Catherine produced Thomas Richardson's portfolio. Within its pages were careful notes, medical descriptions, and dates that matched Edmund Aldridge's decline with Eleanor's illness. And then, most damning of all, Margaret arrived thundering into the square with Charles, Eleanor and Catherine's brother, at her side. Their pursuit, their wild eyes and their violent shouts convinced the constable that something was very wrong indeed. Evidence and arrest. Dr. Hensley was summoned from his bed to examine the portfolio. He turned pale as he read, for he had harbored similar suspicions about Edmund's death. The notes confirmed what he had long feared: arsenic poisoning. Within hours, the constable had assembled a search party. At dawn on May 16, 1861, they entered Ravenscroft Manor. What they found ended any doubts. Hidden in the kitchen pantry were packets of arsenic labeled as rat poison. More was discovered in Margaret's bedroom, and still more sewn into the lining of her favorite coat. The household was riddled with poison, secreted away in places that no innocent explanation could excuse. Margaret was arrested in her drawing room as she sat calmly sipping tea, as though the events of the night had never occurred. She did not flinch when the constable read the charges. She merely raised an eyebrow, set down her cup and said, "This is a mistake, a cruel conspiracy by my ungrateful children." Charles's confession. Charles Aldridge's role was more complicated. The young man, only 23, had fallen under his mother's sway much as Thomas Richardson had. In his jail cell awaiting trial, Charles wrote a long confession in which he admitted his complicity but painted himself as Margaret's victim. He described in horrifying detail how she had seduced and manipulated him, convincing him that silence was necessary to protect his sister's reputations. He confessed that by the time he realized she intended to kill Eleanor, he was already ensnared too deeply to resist. His words were a haunting mixture of guilt, shame and self-deception. "I tell myself I would have found the courage to resist eventually, but in my darkest hours I know that cowardice and desire made me her willing accomplice." The trial begins. By summer of 1861, the case of Margaret Aldridge had become one of the most sensational legal spectacles in Rhode Island. Newport society, once dazzled by her refinement, was now horrified by the revelations. Newspapers across New England reported every detail: the poisoned tea, the pursuit through the night, the shocking betrayal of a mother stealing her daughter's betrothed. Margaret maintained her innocence, her composure so convincing that some in the gallery doubted the charges. But the evidence was overwhelming. Exhumed hair samples from Edmund Aldridge revealed arsenic embedded in the strands. Thomas Richardson's own mysterious death, once ruled a carriage mishap, was re-examined and found consistent with poisoning. Most damning of all, Eleanor herself, still alive but weak, was tested. Arsenic lingered in her system, irrefutable proof that she had been slowly murdered by her own mother. The trial gripped the entire state. Some called Margaret a cold-blooded killer. Others whispered that she was a victim of hysteria, or that her daughters had fabricated their tale to seize an inheritance. But one thing was clear: Margaret Aldridge was no ordinary widow. She was a woman who had turned her household into a house of death, a woman who blurred the line between mother and predator, protector and executioner. The gallows loomed, yet Margaret's composure never broke. In Part 3 we will witness the verdict, the chilling execution, and the decades of silence that followed, until hidden documents in 1924 reopened a nightmare thought long buried. What would drive a mother to such monstrous betrayal? Love of wealth, desire for power, or simply the thrill of control? And how many other women in Victorian America hid arsenic in their cupboards, cloaked by society's refusal to believe them capable of evil? Tell us what you think in the comments. And remember, subscribe to Library of Fear for the next installment, where Ravenscroft Manor's final secrets will be revealed. The trial of Margaret Aldridge. The trial opened in September of 1861. The courthouse was filled beyond capacity. Merchants, servants, journalists, even clergymen crowded the gallery, desperate to glimpse the infamous widow whose crimes had shaken the city. Margaret Aldridge entered the chamber dressed not in mourning garb, but in a black silk gown of the finest quality. Her hair was pinned neatly, her gloves immaculate. She looked more like a hostess preparing for a dinner party than a woman accused of multiple murders. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous detail. First came the medical records, Dr. Hensley's notes, Thomas Richardson's portfolio, and the hair samples from Edmund Aldridge's exhumed body, which revealed lethal traces of arsenic. Then came testimony from household servants, who recalled Margaret's frequent purchases of rat poison, far in excess of what a single household would ever require. Finally, Eleanor herself was brought forward. Still frail, she leaned on Catherine's arm as she entered the courtroom. The audience fell silent. Her pale complexion and trembling hands told a story more powerful than any words. With quiet resolve, Eleanor described how her health declined after meals prepared by her mother, how she grew suspicious of the tea offered nightly, and how Margaret's attentions toward Thomas Richardson grew ever more bold. A mother's defense. Margaret's defense was audacious. She denied every charge, her voice steady and unflinching. She claimed her late husband's death was a tragedy of natural illness, that Thomas Richardson's accident was a cruel twist of fate, and that her daughters had been poisoned by their own nervous conditions. Most striking of all, she accused Eleanor and Catherine of orchestrating a conspiracy against her, driven, she said, by greed for their inheritance and envy of her social influence. "I am the victim here," she declared to the court, her eyes sweeping the gallery. "A widow persecuted by her own children and by men eager to make their reputations at my expense." Her poise unsettled the courtroom. To many she seemed too calm, too composed to be guilty. Some women in the gallery even whispered admiration for her dignity under fire, but the mountain of evidence was against her. Charles on the stand. The prosecution next called Charles Aldridge. Pale and shaken, he admitted to his own complicity, detailing how Margaret had seduced and manipulated him into silence. His words shocked even the most jaded listeners. Here was not merely a tale of poison, but of moral corruption, of a mother who blurred every boundary to ensnare her own son. Charles spoke of his shame, his cowardice, and the lies he told himself as he watched Eleanor waste away. "I believed I was protecting my sisters," he confessed, "but in truth, I was protecting only myself. By the time I understood that she meant to kill Eleanor regardless, I no longer knew how to escape." His testimony broke the courtroom's uneasy sympathy for Margaret. If even her son claimed he was a victim of her influence, then surely she was capable of anything. The public spectacle. Newspapers across New England reported every sordid detail. The Providence Journal ran daily columns describing Margaret's cold demeanor. The Boston Evening Transcript published sketches of the courtroom, Margaret seated with serene detachment as her daughters testified against her. Pamphlets circulated, branding her the Black Widow of Newport and the poisoner of Ravenscroft. Some papers sensationalized her beauty, writing luridly of how she had bewitched both her son and her daughter's fiancé. Others framed her as a cautionary tale of women corrupted by ambition, warning that the boundaries of domestic virtue were not as secure as society liked to believe. The public was divided. Was she a monstrous anomaly, or the unspoken shadow lurking behind many respectable facades? Verdict and sentence. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The gallery hummed with anticipation, and when the jurors returned, the silence was absolute. The foreman's voice rang out, guilty on all counts. Margaret Aldridge was sentenced to death by hanging. Gasps filled the chamber. It was rare for a woman to face such punishment in that era, yet the crimes had been too many, the evidence too damning. Charles received 20 years in prison for his complicity, his youth and remorse sparing him the gallows. Eleanor and Catherine were granted what remained of their father's fortune, though much of it would be consumed by legal costs and restitution. Awaiting the gallows, Margaret was returned to her cell, where she spent the year awaiting execution. Prison matrons reported that she remained composed, even haughty. She read novels, wrote letters, and refused to admit guilt. "My daughters have destroyed me," she declared to one visitor, "but history will vindicate me. They will see I was wronged." Her refusal to break unsettled many. Unlike other condemned prisoners who wept, begged, or confessed, Margaret wore her impending death like a performance. The newspapers feasted on it, describing her as the woman without fear. Charles's final letter. As the months dragged on, Charles's health declined. Imprisoned in damp conditions, he contracted consumption. Shortly before his death in 1873, he wrote one last letter to Eleanor. In it he begged forgiveness, confessing his weakness and expressing the hope that she had found happiness far from Newport. "I was a coward," he wrote. "I let desire make me her accomplice. I pray that God will forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself." His letter would later be preserved in court archives, a haunting testament to the depths of Margaret's corruption. The date of execution was set, October 13, 1862. Crowds would gather to watch one of the rarest spectacles of the age, the public hanging of a woman. Yet Margaret's final performance had not yet begun. She would walk to the gallows in black silk, her composure unshaken, her denial unbroken, as though she intended to carry her secrets with her into the grave. In Part 4, we will stand at the gallows beside Margaret Aldridge, hear her final words, and trace the long shadow Ravenscroft Manor cast over Newport for decades after her death. Do you believe Margaret Aldridge was truly incapable of guilt, or was her calm demeanor the mask of a sociopath? And what does it say about Victorian society that so many were willing to believe her innocence simply because she carried herself with grace? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget subscribe to Library of Fear to join us next time as we follow Margaret to her final hour on the gallows and witness how Ravenscroft Manor was finally abandoned. The March to the Gallows. On the morning of October 13, 1862, the streets of Newport were filled with spectators. By dawn, vendors lined the road selling cider and gingerbread to the throngs who had come to witness what was, in their lifetime, a rarity, the execution of a woman of wealth and breeding. Margaret Aldridge was led from her cell shortly after 8 o'clock. She wore once again her black silk gown, now faded from months of confinement but still elegant. A veil concealed her face, though witnesses noted her calm, almost regal posture as she emerged. The sheriff read her sentence. She nodded, murmuring only, "I have nothing to confess. I am innocent." Her words stirred whispers in the crowd. Some believed her denial genuine, others saw in it only arrogance. The gallows speech. Margaret mounted the scaffold with unhurried steps. The hangman adjusted the rope while she turned to face the crowd. Removing her veil, she revealed a face composed, her eyes sharp and unflinching. Her final words were brief. "I die betrayed, slandered, and condemned by lies. To those who call me a murderess, I say only this: history will judge you more harshly than it judges me." She refused prayer, refused confession. The noose was placed around her neck, and the hood drawn over her head. At precisely 10:14 a.m., the trap was released. Margaret Aldridge dropped, and with a single violent jolt, her life ended. The crowd erupted in shouts, some of horror, some of grim satisfaction. Mothers clutched their children closer, men removed their hats in solemnity. Yet beneath it all was a fascination, a morbid thrill that had drawn them there in the first place. Aftermath in Newport. Her body was buried in the family plot at Island Cemetery, though rumors persisted that she had been secretly removed by admirers who wished to preserve her remains. Some claimed her grave was desecrated, others that her coffin was empty from the start. The Aldridge name became cursed in Newport society. Eleanor and Catherine attempted to rebuild their lives far from Rhode Island, eventually settling in Boston under altered surnames, yet gossip followed them wherever they went. Marriage prospects were scarce. The shadow of their mother's crime seemed to stain them in the eyes of respectable families. The fate of Ravenscroft Manor. Ravenscroft itself was abandoned. No tenant would remain long in its halls. Servants claimed to hear footsteps at night, the sound of cups clinking in the dining room, or the faint rustle of skirts along the corridors. One maid swore she saw Margaret standing by the parlor window, her veil lifted, gazing out into the street. By 1870, the manor fell into ruin. Weeds consumed the garden, shutters hung loose, and rats scurried across the once elegant ballroom floor. Children dared each other to approach the gates, whispering that if one peered long enough through the cracks, a pale face would peer back. Even in decay, Ravenscroft remained a place of fascination. Local law claimed that on October 13th, the anniversary of the execution, the sound of a trapdoor creaking open could be heard within the house. Charles's legacy. Charles Aldridge's imprisonment ended not with release but with death. In 1873, his lungs consumed by disease, he was buried in a pauper's grave outside Providence. Few attended the funeral. His name, like his mother's, became a byword for weakness and disgrace. His final letter to Eleanor was discovered years later in the court archives, a crumbling sheet stained with ink and tears. It became an object of macabre interest, copied into pamphlets and retold in newspapers long after the case had faded from living memory. Eleanor and Catherine's silence. The sisters never again spoke publicly of their mother. Eleanor married late in life, her health permanently impaired by the arsenic she had survived. Catherine remained unmarried, serving as caretaker to her sister until her death in 8. Neighbors described the two as kind but withdrawn, their household quiet, their curtains often drawn. On the rare occasions they entertained, they forbade any mention of Newport or Ravenscroft Manor. It was as though they had sealed those memories away, though the scars lingered in their eyes. The case in history. For decades, Margaret Aldridge's trial remained a touchstone in Rhode Island legal history. Law students studied it as an example of forensic evidence, particularly the pioneering use of hair samples to prove arsenic poisoning. But beyond the medical and legal significance, the story persisted as a cautionary tale of family corruption. Preachers warned their congregations of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of women who defied their natural place. Feminist writers of the later 19th century, in contrast, saw in Margaret a twisted reflection of the constraints imposed upon women, who were denied power until they grasped it by illicit means. Her story was retold in penny dreadfuls, embellished with ghostly encounters and fictionalized dialogue. By the 20th century, she was half historical figure, half legend, the Black Widow of Newport, lingering dread. To this day, locals in Newport claim that Ravenscroft's ruins are haunted. Though the manor itself was demolished in 1912, visitors to the grounds report strange chills, the faint scent of bitter almonds, the telltale odor of arsenic, and on autumn nights the sight of a veiled woman gliding silently across the field where the gallows once stood. Whether ghost, memory, or imagination, the name Aldridge has never entirely faded. It lives on in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy knowledge that the most monstrous acts often take place, not in dungeons or alleyways, but in the hearth and parlor, under the guise of love. And so ends the tale of Margaret Aldridge, the mother who stole her daughter's fiancé, who poisoned her own family, who met the rope without confession. But as you leave this story, consider, evil rarely dies with the body, it lingers in the places it once dwelled.
Should you walk the old grounds of Newport on a misted October morning and hear the creak of a trapdoor where no wood remains, do not linger, do not look back, because some performances never end. You may think the story ended on October 13, 1862, with the drop of a rope and the stilling of Margaret Aldridge's heart, but history is rarely so tidy. For even in death, Margaret's presence lingered, woven into the whispers of Newport's streets, etched into the ruins of Ravenscroft Manor, and carried across generations in fragments of rumor and ghostly encounters. What if Margaret's tale did not end at the gallows, but began again in legend? The aftershocks. In the months following the execution, Newport society remained transfixed. Newspapers dissected every detail of the trial, but the true obsession lay elsewhere, in the idea that Ravenscroft Manor itself had absorbed the corruption of its mistress. Former servants refused to enter the house. Tradesmen reported strange happenings when collecting furniture for auction, mirrors cracking on their own, a sickly sweet scent of almonds clinging to the walls. Buyers who expected to find a fortune in silverware and books often returned items within days, claiming they carried a taint. The Aldridge name vanished from polite conversation, yet on dark nights tavern-goers spoke of Margaret as if she still lived. "She'll never rest," they whispered, "not after what she did to her own blood."
The children's children, Eleanor and Catherine, fled westward, but scandal traveled faster than distance. In Boston, they lived under assumed surnames. Eleanor remained unmarried, her health fragile. Catherine married a doctor, giving her 4 children, though she kept them carefully shielded from the Aldridge history. Yet family secrets rarely stay buried. In 1901, one of Catherine's sons reportedly uncovered the truth after stumbling upon a yellowed newspaper clipping in a medical archive. Horrified, he confronted his mother, who confirmed only one thing: never speak her name. She has no place among us. That same son would later tell his own children of the curse, that any Aldridge descendant who returned to Newport would meet misfortune. Whether born of superstition or lived experience, strange accidents did seem to shadow the bloodline. The ruins of Ravenscroft. By 1875, Ravenscroft Manor stood largely abandoned, its once proud gardens consumed by weeds. Vagrants used the cellars for shelter, though many left in terror after reporting muffled voices or the scrape of silk shoes across empty floors. One squatter claimed to see a woman in black descending the grand staircase at dawn, her face pale as wax, her lips moving soundlessly. He swore she paused at the bottom step, fixing him with eyes that glowed faintly in the gloom. He fled barefoot, never to return. In 1899, the estate was purchased by a Boston shipping magnate who intended to demolish it. Workmen dismantling the house uncovered something peculiar in the walls of the east wing: dozens of small glass vials wrapped in cloth and hidden between bricks. Many contained residue that, when tested years later, proved to be arsenic. Local papers revived the tale, dubbing Margaret New England's Black Widow. Sales of lurid pamphlets soared, and ghost hunters flocked to the ruins. The ghost stories. Legends multiplied. Some claimed to see Margaret's figure drifting through the orchard, veil trailing behind her like a funeral banner. Others heard faint weeping from the cellar where Thomas Richardson's papers had once been hidden. The most chilling reports came from children. On Halloween nights, daring youths would sneak into the ruins. Many returned pale, insisting they had seen a woman at the top of the staircase, her hands outstretched as if beckoning them closer. One boy swore she whispered, "Stay for tea, dear, it will do you no harm." The 1924 discovery. During renovations on a neighboring property in 1924, workers uncovered a trunk buried beneath a collapsed outbuilding. Inside lay water-damaged court documents, letters from Charles Aldridge, and fragments of Margaret's correspondence. Most shocking was an unfinished letter in her hand, dated the week before her arrest. It contained chilling words. "If they believe they can strip me of what is mine, they are gravely mistaken. I will endure beyond this flesh. I will not be forgotten. My daughters may betray me, but they will never escape me." Historians debated its authenticity, but locals took it as proof of the curse. That same year, multiple unexplained fires broke out in Newport, one of them consuming the last standing remnants of Ravenscroft stables. The curse renewed. By the 20th century, Margaret's story blurred into folklore. Tour guides retold it on lantern-lit walks through Newport, embellishing the tale with ghostly apparitions and secret tunnels. Yet for some, the horrors remained all too real. In 1952, a descendant of the Aldridge family, unaware of his ancestry, rented a house near the old Ravenscroft grounds. Within weeks, he reported dreams of a veiled woman urging him to finish her work. His health declined rapidly. He was diagnosed with unexplained arsenic traces in his blood. He survived, but left Rhode Island, swearing never to return. Coincidence, or the long shadow of Margaret Aldridge's hand? The house that wouldn't rest. Though demolished in 1912, Ravenscroft's land never prospered. Businesses failed, crops withered, tenants departed within months. Developers attempted to build modern houses in the 1970s, but every project fell through. Today the land remains an overgrown lot, choked with brambles. Locals refuse to walk it after dark. On misty autumn nights, passers-by claim to hear the creak of a rope swinging, though no tree grows there. Some even report the taste of metal on their tongues, the same metallic bitterness doctors once associated with arsenic poisoning. Lingering questions. Margaret Aldridge was convicted, hanged and buried. Yet questions remain. How many victims truly lay in her wake? Were the arsenic vials discovered in 1899 her full arsenal, or were there more hidden caches? And most unsettling of all, why do sightings of her figure continue, over a century later? Skeptics dismiss the legends as folklore. Believers insist her spirit roams still, bound by rage, by betrayal, by an oath she wrote in her final days. I will not be forgotten. So ask yourself, does evil die on the gallows, or does it seep into the walls, into the bloodlines, into the soil itself? Perhaps Margaret Aldridge was more than a poisoner. Perhaps she was a curse made flesh, a curse that even now waits for the next curious soul to wander too close to the ruins of Ravenscroft Manor. And should you feel a chill, smell the faint trace of bitter almonds, or hear a woman's voice inviting you to stay, remember the fate of those who trusted her once. Drink nothing, trust no one, and for God's sake, never look back. The birth of a local legend. By the 1960s, Margaret Aldridge had become a campfire tale. Teenagers whispered her name on midnight dares, claiming to hear her voice on the old manor grounds. Some described faint weeping drifting from the brambles. Others heard laughter, sharp and cold. It was during this period that the first investigators arrived, amateurs with tape recorders, flash cameras and Ouija boards. A group of college students from Providence recorded hours of static one October night, but upon replay several claimed to hear a woman's voice beneath the hiss, "Stay with me, stay forever." Skeptics dismissed the sounds as interference, but one of the students, a young woman named Lydia Marsh, developed a sudden illness weeks later: vomiting, tremors, hair loss. Medical tests revealed unexplained traces of arsenic in her blood. The newspapers didn't connect her case to Margaret. Locals did. Historians reopened the files. In 1983, a Rhode Island historical society undertook a project to digitize old trial records. Among them was Margaret Aldridge's case. Researchers were struck by the sheer weight of evidence: Thomas Richardson's portfolio, Charles's confession, and the chemical analysis of Edmund Aldridge's remains. But the most disturbing find was a set of sealed letters never released during the trial, written by Eleanor and Catherine years after the fact. One fragment read, "Though she is gone, I feel her in every shadow. I cannot breathe without expecting to smell almonds. I cannot sleep without hearing her voice whispering at my door." These letters reignited fascination with the case, sparking articles in true crime magazines and even a PBS documentary in 19... From then on, Margaret Aldridge was no longer a half-forgotten poisoner. She was a specter. Paranormal expeditions. By the 1990s, ghost hunting groups began frequenting the Ravenscroft site, armed with infrared cameras and EMF detectors. Several reported spikes in electromagnetic activity, sudden drops in temperature, and most disturbingly, the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds wafting through the ruins with no natural source. One team claimed to capture an apparition, a tall woman in black, face obscured, standing motionless at the top of a vanished staircase. The photograph, grainy but chilling, was published in a local paper under the headline, "Margaret Still Walks Newport." Skeptics pointed out double exposures and pareidolia. Believers swore it was proof. But it wasn't only cameras that caught her. Several investigators fell ill after visiting: nausea, dizziness, stomach cramps. Blood tests often showed elevated levels of toxins, though none could explain how. The 2004 incident, the most infamous modern case, occurred in October 2004. A group of amateur paranormal researchers calling themselves the Night Watch live-streamed from the overgrown lot where Ravenscroft once stood. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. They joked, whispered, and wandered with flashlights. Then at precisely 2:13 a.m. the stream captured a voice, clear, female, and close to the microphone. "Have you come to drink?" The team froze. Seconds later, one member, Rachel Gibbons, collapsed. Her companions rushed her to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed sudden acute arsenic poisoning. Rachel survived, but with permanent damage to her nervous system. The stream was pulled offline, but fragments remain archived on obscure forums, shared among those who whisper about Margaret Aldridge's curse. The land nobody wants. Developers have tried repeatedly to reclaim the land. Plans for apartments in 1978, a shopping complex in 1999, and luxury homes in 2016 all collapsed under bizarre circumstances, investors backing out without reason, contractors suffering accidents, equipment failing inexplicably. In 2016, a backhoe driver clearing brush was thrown violently from his machine when it overturned on level ground. He swore he felt someone yank his shoulder just before the crash. The land remains vacant today, choked with thorns and silence. Even birds avoid it. Modern descendants. Though Eleanor and Catherine tried to sever ties, genealogists in 2019 traced living descendants of the Aldridge line to families in California and New York. One descendant, when contacted, admitted she had grown up hearing whispers of the poison widow, but dismissed them as superstition. Yet she confessed something unsettling. Her grandmother never allowed almond extract in the house. She said it brought bad luck, the woman explained, as if Margaret could find us through the smell. Science versus superstition. Skeptics argue that lingering tales of illness and hauntings are psychosomatic, the power of suggestion combined with the real dangers of arsenic once dumped or hidden in the soil. But believers point to the pattern, the voices on recordings, the sudden sicknesses, the letters Eleanor wrote long after Margaret's death. If fear alone causes these manifestations, why do so many independent accounts align so precisely? Lingering presence. Today, if you stand at the edge of the Ravenscroft lot at dusk, you may notice how the wind seems to pause. You may feel watched, though no one stands near, and if you breathe deeply, you may catch it, the faintest trace of almonds, sweet and suffocating. Those who linger too long claim to hear her voice, always soft, always persuasive. Stay a while, my dear. You're looking so pale. Let me fix you something to drink. And if you hear that, it may already be too late. Margaret Aldridge was hanged in 8, yet her story bleeds through centuries, through soil, through bloodlines. Some say it's simply memory that keeps her alive. Others insist it's something darker, an oath fulfilled, a hunger that never left her body. So if you're ever in Newport and you find yourself drawn to a tangled lot where nothing grows, do not step inside. Do not answer if a voice calls your name. And above all, never accept the invitation of a woman who smiles too sweetly and asks if you're thirsty. Drink nothing, trust no one, and pray the past stays buried. In 1871, nearly a decade after Margaret's execution, Rhode Island authorities quietly authorized the exhumation of Edmund Aldridge's body. Officially, the purpose was to confirm suspicions of arsenic poisoning. Unofficially, it was an attempt to silence gossip that Margaret had been condemned on circumstantial evidence. The soil surrounding Edmund's coffin tested heavily for arsenic, a discovery initially attributed to groundwater contamination. Yet hair samples preserved by the damp earth carried the unmistakable chemical signatures of repeated poisoning. Elevated levels spread across several inches of hair growth, showing months of ingestion rather than a single dose. This was not an accident. It was a campaign. The Richardson papers. When Thomas Richardson's original notebooks resurfaced in the late 20th century, toxicologists marveled at his precision. Though his handwriting shook with age, his diagrams of crystallization and his notes on odor of almonds upon heating were startlingly modern. He had used what was known then as the Marsh test, a groundbreaking method for detecting arsenic. By producing a silvery black deposit when gas from a poison sample was ignited, Richardson confirmed what the Aldridge household already suspected, that death had been carried in the teacup. What fascinated later chemists was his notation in the margin, administered in such quantities as to mimic illness, never violent seizure. Patient grows wan over weeks, rather than hours, clever beyond cruelty. This observation aligned perfectly with Margaret's psychology. She didn't kill in a fit of rage. She killed in a slow, calculated symphony, savoring each stage of decline. The arsenic widow profile. Criminal psychologists in the 1950s revisited the case, labeling Margaret Aldridge one of America's earliest black widows, women who used poison to remove obstacles, often cloaked in domestic normalcy. Unlike infamous later figures such as Mary Ann Cotton in England, Margaret's crimes carried an unusual twist. She did not kill for money alone. Her hunger was emotional possession, removing her husband, targeting her daughter, and finally attempting to claim Charles for herself. Dr. Elaine Kavanagh, a forensic psychologist at Yale, summarized Margaret's profile in a 2003 paper. Margaret Aldridge exemplifies a fusion of narcissistic hunger and chemical cunning. She weaponized nurture itself, converting meals, tea, and comfort into vehicles of domination. She killed not from poverty or desperation, but from appetite, the desire to own and consume love. The medical mystery of inherited illness. For generations, descendants of Eleanor and Catherine carried whispered fears of weak blood. Many reported unexplained fainting spells, tremors, and brittle hair. In the early 20th century, family doctors described the condition as nervous constitution. Only later did researchers speculate that prolonged exposure to arsenic in the Ravenscroft household may have left lasting damage on surviving daughters. Chronic arsenic toxicity can cause neuropathy, hair loss, and immune weakness, symptoms uncannily consistent with their records. Thus, even those Margaret failed to kill may have carried her poison in their very cells. Digitizing the darkness. In 2012, Brown University launched a project to digitize all known Aldridge trial documents. High-resolution scans revealed something scholars had long overlooked: faint smudges in the margins of Margaret's letters. When analyzed
vaporized under UV light, these stains tested positive for trace arsenic crystals. Forensic archivists believe she may have handled her letters after preparing poisons, leaving microscopic death woven into her correspondence. Margaret's words, in other words, were not just metaphorically toxic, they were literally contaminated. The forensic simulation. In 2017, a team of chemists recreated Margaret's recipes in a controlled laboratory setting, using 19th century cookbooks and documented ingredients. They tested how arsenic could be disguised in common dishes of the era, stews, pastries, and tea. The results were horrifying. In hot liquids, arsenic trioxide dissolved completely, leaving no taste and no visible residue. In custards and cakes, it blended seamlessly with sugar. One toxicologist remarked during the study, "It is disturbingly easy. A Victorian kitchen with access to rat poison was a perfect murder lab." Margaret had not been a genius chemist. She had simply recognized how effortlessly domestic life could become deadly. The curse in the laboratory. Several modern researchers who worked on Aldridge materials reported unsettling experiences. One graduate student fainted while examining Edmund's preserved hair samples, though no toxins were detected in the lab. Another described vivid nightmares after transcribing Margaret's final testimony, always involving a woman whispering at her bedside. Though scientists dismiss these as stress-induced, the overlap with paranormal accounts unsettles even hardened professionals. It is as though Margaret's poison lingers not only in matter but in memory itself. Ethical debates. Margaret Aldridge's case has sparked uncomfortable ethical debates in forensic circles. Should a murderer's tools and letters be preserved, studied, even exhibited, or do such acts risk glorifying evil? In 2018, a traveling museum exhibit on historical poisoners planned to feature Margaret's original letters and Richardson's arsenic test apparatus. Public outcry in Rhode Island forced the exhibit to withdraw her artifacts. Protesters argued that displaying her personal effects turned family tragedy into spectacle. Yet others insisted that forgetting such cases only invites repetition. "History must be dissected," wrote one toxicologist, "so the wounds do not fester unseen." The science of fear. Today, Margaret Aldridge exists at the uneasy intersection of hard science and folklore. On one hand, her case is a textbook study in toxicology, a perfect example of slow arsenic poisoning, forensic breakthrough, and criminal psychology. On the other hand, she is a specter whose almond-scented presence haunts laboratories as much as it does abandoned ruins. Fear, after all, has chemistry too. Adrenaline surging, cortisol flooding the body, perception warping. Whether or not Margaret's ghost walks Newport, her story continues to poison minds with dread, an echo of her favorite method. Forensic science promised to bury superstition under data, to explain away ghosts with chemistry and psychology. Yet with Margaret Aldridge, every answer leads only to darker questions. Why did a mother's love sour into possession? Why did comfort transform into cruelty? And why, more than a century and a half later, does her presence still infect both the living body and the living mind? Perhaps the truest poison is not arsenic at all. Perhaps it is memory, passed down, inhaled, tasted in whispers. A toxin that never loses potency. And Margaret Aldridge knew this better than anyone. By the 1880s, scarcely 20 years after Margaret's death, children in Newport dared one another to recite her name 3 times in the darkened hallways of abandoned houses. Local mothers warned misbehaving daughters, "Mind yourself, or Margaret will feed you sugar." Sailors' wives whispered that Aldridge women carried poison in the bloodline, an old-world superstition merging with new-world gossip. Within a generation, Margaret ceased being only a person. She became an omen, proof that evil could wear silk gloves and sit at the head of the family table.
The stage play of 1894. The first fictionalization of her life came in Providence in 1894, in a short-lived stage play titled The Widow's Cup. Though names were altered, audiences recognized Margaret at once. In the play, the mother character seduces her daughter's betrothed, whispering, "Drink, my love. What hurts you heals me." The performance scandalized polite society, but the playbill sold out each night until church leaders pressured the theater to close it down. Ironically, the controversy only deepened the legend. Soon, Margaret was not just a warning, she was entertainment. The Gothic novel of 1912. A minor novelist, Cornelia Rathbone, published The Poisoned Veil in 1912, loosely based on the Aldridge case. Rathbone portrayed Margaret as both villain and victim, suggesting she had been driven to madness by her husband's cruelty. Critics dismissed it as sensational pulp, but readers devoured it. Passages describing Margaret's methods, arsenic folded into pastries, Lace gloves dusted with powder were cited in newspapers as too lurid for ladies' eyes. Yet the novel sold out multiple printings. Literary scholars later noted that Rathbone's book anticipated tropes that would dominate Gothic fiction: the house as a corrupt womb, the mother as predator, love curdled into appetite. Margaret Aldridge had become archetype, the silent film of 1927. By the 1920s, with silent cinema at its height, Hollywood adapted the tale under the title The House That Poisoned Itself. Though heavily fictionalized, intertitles quoted fragments from Richardson's testimony. The mother's character, played by famed actress Louise Dandridge, gazed at her daughter and declared, "If you will not love me, I will take the one who does." Audiences were unsettled, but enthralled. Though the film is now considered lost, reviews describe fainting spells in theaters and women leaving mid-show, whispering they could taste almonds in the air. Thus Margaret Aldridge moved from courtroom to culture, her poison spilling into the new medium of film, the forbidden ballad. In the 1930s, a folk ballad circulated in New England taverns, "The widow in black, with sugar so sweet, she fed you your death in each morsel you eat. Beware of her cup, beware of her kiss, for love like her love tastes nothing like bliss." The song was banned from radio for encouraging superstition, but bootleg recordings survived. Even now, fragments surface in archives, sung in cracked voices, eerie as any dirge. Mid-century silence. Curiously, between the 1940s and 1960s, Margaret seemed to vanish from public discourse. Historians believe this was partly due to the rise of psychological explanations for crime, which replaced folkloric terrors with clinical diagnoses. To a culture obsessed with Freudian theories, Margaret was not a demon, but a case study in maternal pathology. Doctors spoke of Oedipal inversion and narcissistic disturbance. The supernatural aura dimmed, but never died. It lingered in family whispers, in unshelved books, in the stubborn fear that a woman could kill not from hunger or survival but from desire. The 1970s revival. Margaret returned in force during the 1970s, a decade steeped in both feminism and horror cinema. The women's liberation movement reclaimed her story as an example of patriarchy's silenced victim. Radical writers argued that Margaret's monstrosity reflected a society that caged women in gilded prisons, driving them to madness. Meanwhile, horror directors resurrected her as archetype. The 1975 cult film Mother's Hand depicted a widow who poisons her family while seducing her son-in-law. The tagline read, "Her love is undying, yours won't be." Though critics panned it, the film developed a cult following. Margaret was no longer just a ghost of Newport. She was an international emblem of maternal dread. The digital age and creepypasta. In the 2000s, Margaret's story migrated onto forums, blogs, and creepypasta threads. Anonymous posters claimed to have seen her reflection in cracked mirrors, or to have tasted sweet almonds after reading her name aloud. Some insisted her letters carried a curse, warning that if you read her words at midnight, she will finish the cup. Skeptics dismissed these as internet folklore, yet they spread widely. Videos analyzing the widow of Ravenscroft drew millions of views. Fanfiction reimagined her as vampire, witch, or ghost bride. Margaret Aldridge had transcended history. She was meme, myth, and malediction all at once. The curse of her name. What makes her endure when countless other poisoners are forgotten? Why does her story, above all others, persist in both archives and nightmares? Perhaps it is because she inverted nature itself. A mother is meant to protect, to nurture, to guide. Margaret weaponized nurture, turning meals into executions and love into suffocation. Every retelling confronts the same terror. If even a mother's embrace can conceal arsenic, then nowhere is safe. Not home, not family, not love. That is why her name still carries weight. Why even today locals whisper uneasily in Newport taverns when Ravenscroft is mentioned. To speak Margaret's name is to remember that horror wears the face of kin. Folklore scholars often say that a story survives because it still serves a purpose. If Margaret Aldridge endures, it is because she continues to answer something buried in human fear, the question of whether love itself can become fatal. And so, from pulpit to playhouse, from silent film to online horror threads, her poison has never stopped spreading. Not through teacups now, but through culture itself. One might argue she claimed immortality after all, not through flesh, through story. After Margaret's execution, Ravenscroft Manor stood hollow, its curtains drawn like lids over dead eyes. Neighbors whispered that the house exhaled sickness. Visitors described almond-scented air in the hallways, a detail uncanny given the association with arsenic. By the late 1870s, the Aldridge daughters abandoned Rhode Island altogether, selling the estate at a ruinous loss. Buyers came and went, but none stayed. One Boston family demolished the manor in 1883, swearing that the place rejected us. Yet even demolished, the land remained unsettled. Workmen claimed tools vanished. Livestock refused to graze near the old foundation. Children dared each other to bring spoons of sugar to the ruins and leave them overnight. By morning the sugar was always damp, bitter, indibble. The confession of Charles Whitcomb. Margaret's accomplice Charles Whitcomb left behind a jailhouse confession that surfaced decades late. In it he admitted not only to assisting Margaret but to dreaming of her after her death. He wrote, "She comes to me in sleep, dressed in the same black gown she wore to the gallows. She whispers in my ear, asking for the cup. I taste almonds upon waking, and my teeth ache as though sugar has been packed into them. I beg forgiveness, but she will not relent." Whitcomb died in his cell, consumed by tuberculosis. His guards swore that in his final hour, he raised his hand as though to accept a glass no one offered. The exhumation of 1924. During renovations in 1924, workers unearthed a box of Margaret's preserved letters beneath the manor's collapsed cellar. The handwriting was steady, her words unrepentant. "Death is nothing but another room. I intend to occupy it." The letters were catalogued, then sealed in the Newport Historical Society archives. Strangely, archivists reported nausea, headaches, and an almond taste while handling the papers. One clerk resigned after claiming Margaret's handwriting moved on its own. Though skeptics argue this was coincidence, the records remain rarely accessed, hidden deep in restricted storage. Echoes in the 20th century. Throughout the mid-1900s, reports surfaced of strange illnesses in homes built near the Ravenscroft lot. Families described children wasting away from stomach cramps and fevers. Doctors diagnosed influenza or foodborne infection, but locals muttered, "Margaret is still feeding." By the 1970s, urban explorers trespassed on the ruins, leaving with tales of whispers and the sensation of a hand pressing sugar into their palms. Some never returned, others returned changed, sickly, paranoid, muttering about mothers who watched them through mirrors. Police reports from this era dismissed these accounts as hysteria. Still, the whispers endured. Digital sightings. In the 2000s, as the internet became folklore's new home, reports of Margaret Aldridge multiplied. Forum threads spoke of a widow in black appearing in mirror selfies, her face faint, her hands clutching a teacup. Reddit posts described college students researching her case, only to find ants swarming their sugar jars for weeks afterward. TikTok users filmed themselves reading her letters aloud. Several videos ended abruptly with coughing fits, gasps, or the phone falling sideways. Skeptics call this mass suggestion, proof that stories infect the mind like virus. But believers argue Margaret has adapted her poison, not chemical now, but cultural. To speak her name, to click her image, is to sip from her cup. The question of her survival. Historians insist Margaret Aldridge was hanged. The records are clear, and yet, a fragment from a prison chaplain's diary fuels speculation. He wrote on October 13, 1862, "The woman's face was serene, too serene. The trapdoor fell, yet no mark showed on her throat. When I closed her eyes, I thought I saw them shift as if mocking me. She left this world as if she had somewhere better to go." The diary was dismissed as overwrought fancy. Still, the idea lingers. Did Margaret truly die, or did she carry her poison into something unseen? The dread of her daughters. Eleanor and Catherine never returned to Rhode Island. Eleanor lived in California until her death in 1919, refusing marriage, dedicating herself to helping women escape abusive homes. Catherine married, but forbade her children from ever speaking of their grandmother. Letters between the sisters reveal lingering dread. Catherine wrote in 1888, "I wake at night and hear her voice, soft as moth wings, whispering through the floorboards. Eleanor, we are not free." She drinks still. If the daughters never forgave, perhaps it was because they felt her presence long after the rope had broken her neck. The poison in the present. Today, Margaret Aldridge is remembered in Newport as both cautionary tale and urban legend. Tour guides speak of her with hushed tones. True crime enthusiasts analyze her like a specimen. Horror channels retell her crimes for audiences across the world. And yet, strange reports persist. Visitors to her grave claim flowers wither within hours. Archivists report the smell of almonds in sealed rooms. Genealogists note uncanny patterns of sudden illness in Aldridge descendants. It is as though Margaret's poison was never only chemical. It seeped into language, into memory, into bloodlines. The climax of the legend. If you stand at the site of Ravenscroft Manor today,
Locals say you must not speak her name. The wind will rise, your throat will dry, and if you listen closely, you will hear the sound of a spoon stirring sugar in an empty cup. Some insist this is imagination, others warn. She waits for anyone who dares to remember her too vividly. Perhaps Margaret Aldridge achieved what she always sought, not merely survival, but permanence. She stole more than her daughter's fiancé. She stole history itself, ensuring